Welcome, everyone. I see quite a few people out there. We are really excited to have you join us in this new format of the virtual FBLI sessions this year. So we're going to talk about purchasing of product and being able to fill the gap between the people that you're serving versus the food that was coming in from the donation perspective, particularly as impacted by COVID. And we are thrilled to have network speakers join us, some real strong leaders in the network, as well as really experienced leaders of teams that are doing some great work around purchasing to be able to access food in an efficient way as they work with their suppliers in their communities. So we have Brianna Casey, who's the CEO from Food Bank Australia. And then we
Welcome,
have,
everyone.
oh good, look at this, is like a magic screen here. Brianna just popped up, hello. Then we also have Vandana Singh, who's the CEO of the India Food Banking Network. Vandana, up, there you
Hi.
go. Pop, hello. And then Joe Dyson, who is the head of the food team at FairShare in the UK, is joining us as well. So I think we have a full range of time zones represented, around 24 hours. So we really appreciate these wonderful ladies and powerful leaders in the network and spending your time and your expertise in sharing with the rest of the network. So to start off, Brianna, why don't we start with you? Can you share a little bit around how COVID impacted your work at the food bank, and then specifically around how purchasing became a key factor in meeting the need for your communities? I
Mm.
know I should set a little bit of a setup that we hope that you did review all of the materials that were provided ahead of time. But if you didn't have time to read through all of the materials and absorb all that really amazing information, feel free to follow along. We're going to do a little bit of summary in the beginning, but then the materials are available for follow-up. This is available as a recording, and then we'll be taking questions as we go. So I forgot to do some housekeeping, Brianna, sorry. This is my
No
first time of
problem.
following run a show as we do the conversation. For everyone who's attending, if you have questions, please, please, please ask them. There's lots of ways you can do that. You can raise your hand, you can chat in the chat box, or once we get through a couple of warm-up questions, we'll unmute you so that you can ask questions as you raise your hand. Tony, David, and January are all watching, so be engage. We want this to be a conversation. We really want to talk to these experts and think about what their learning can do in your communities. So did I cover all of it? We've got an hour. Okay, excellent. I'm getting signals from the control booth. Okay, again, Brianna, sorry, why don't you share your experience in Australia and how purchasing has changed and helped you serve your community?
Fabulous. Well, first of all, thank you for tuning in and thanks for making the time. For those of you who have jumped on the link that Tony popped in the chat box, our lovely briefing note is really colourful. You'll notice it for heavy purple, blue and orange. So if that's the one you're looking for when I'm speaking, that's helpful. And we've also got Kate on the Zoom, who is the author of this wonderful document. So you're welcome to follow up with either one of us after the session. In terms of what COVID did for Food Bank, it's probably useful for me to set the scene about what was happening before COVID. In normal times or pre-COVID times, purchase for us was about 15% of what we do at Food Bank. So about 85% of what we do is through traditional food rescue. And then we are involved in both a collaborative supply program where we are manufacturing and developing products, as well as direct purchasing in the case of hampers, whether it be Christmas hampers or drought hampers. And then we also purchase products for school breakfast programs. For us in Australia, we came off the back of devastating bushfires in January, and that actually depleted a lot of our reserves of stock that we would traditionally have available in our warehouses. So when COVID hit us in March, and I know that for a lot of you it had exactly the same impact, very significant disruption amongst just food and grocery supply chains, very significant impacts in terms of panic buying and really limiting essential item access. And we in fact had to place limits on some of the products that we make available as well. And so for us, we went from a scenario where most of that 85% of our total volumes in food rescue disappeared overnight. So we became completely reliant on purchase. The challenge for us in the early days of COVID was, even if we threw money at the problem, we couldn't solve it because there wasn't product available for us to purchase. The big challenge we had was a lot of the traditional manufacturers that would support Food Bank were doing double and triple shifts to try and keep up with the demand in the supermarkets, which meant even if we offered to purchase product direct off them, they simply didn't have spare capacity within their manufacturing supply chains. So for us, it was very much about, one, securing the funds to be able to purchase if we did find an opportunity to purchase. And I know we'll get into government funding and other external sources of funding later in the chat. But it was around securing those funds and then really honing in on what we have in Australia, which is very established, mature relationships with those manufacturers and the retailers, which meant that we could go and have conversations, and very difficult conversations, with the heads of supply chain, with the CEOs of these retailers and manufacturers to say, we need you to set some product aside for Food Bank. We know that's not necessarily going to be what traditional customers in supermarkets want to see and hear, but we need you to understand that when people can't buy product in a supermarket, the most vulnerable people in our community don't have access to anything. So we were able to convince our manufacturing partners to set product aside for us so that we could purchase products that you simply could not get in Australia: pasta, rice, pasta sauce, breakfast cereal. So for us, it boiled down to extraordinary relationships with our manufacturers and retailers, placing limits on what was available through the network, and really being very clever about the way that we could conduct our traditional gearing in terms of how cheaply we could get these products and how quickly we could get it out of the door. Does that answer the first question?
I think that's an amazing start. I've got lots of follow-up questions, but we're going to let Vandana and Joe both talk and then see what the audience comes up with in terms of additional information. I think that was very helpful. Thank you. Vandana, how about you? Can you share a little bit? Again, Brianna did a good job of setting the stage a little bit prior to COVID and then talking about the impact. Can you do the same in terms of the network that you're working with in India?
Yeah, sure. So the main, I'm audible, right? So the main source of food for India Food Banking Network has been, again, the surplus packaged food industry from the food businesses. So that is what we were mostly handling during the pre-COVID days. However, when the pandemic broke out, India's strategy was to go in for an immediate extended lockdown. This helped us avert the pressure on the healthcare system, but the lockdown resulted in a drop in economic activity and loss of livelihoods for migrant workers and workers in the unorganized sector. And the needs of these families in distress was more for emergency food assistance comprising of basic essentials such as rice, wheat flour, pulses, cooking oil, which were not traditionally donated by the food businesses to us. We had therefore to pivot immediately to the purchase of these products and sourcing of funds from our donors for the same. Fortunately for us, we've built very strong partnerships over the years, and they all helped us to coordinate our response to the food crisis, which was triggered by the pandemic. Traditionally, through the last few years, our strategy has always been focused on partnerships and building alliances, because you see, India is a very vast country with 1.3 billion people and great cultural diversity. But fortunately, we have a lot of not-for-profit organizations who know the local vulnerable communities and their needs well. So we have never established a parallel system of distribution. Instead, we have partnered with a large number of organizations, who have local feeding programs and local outreach. And therefore, we immediately as soon as the pandemic broke out and the food crisis was triggered, we were able to reach out to our donors for funding these ration kits, the emergency food assistance, and distribute them through these not-for-profit organizations who are our partners at the ground level. Karen,
sorry, thank you. Excellent, thank you. I'm just taking notes for follow-up questions as well. I think that does a really great summary of the change that you guys faced as well. Interesting, both Australia, India, huge countries, right? Exactly. So, and very diverse cultures. Joe, same question to you. Take us through sort of what the pandemic did in terms of changing for you, and then you also have a unique situation in terms of the coinciding with Brexit in terms of impact on your economy. And so talk a little bit about how this last year has been challenging and sort of the changes that that the combined economic impacts had on your sourcing food, including purchasing.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everyone. I can't say good morning or good afternoon because it depends where you are, or good evening. Yes, so obviously the UK is much smaller than India or Australia, but with some common challenges and some different ones. So we came into COVID already anticipating some disruption to supply because, as Karen mentioned, there was a Brexit, that's Britain leaving the EU, in case anybody was not aware, which, depending on what outcome the government negotiated with Europe, could potentially have impacted food supplies. So the food industry had got high levels of stock. Prior to COVID actually hitting in the UK, because it was in the media elsewhere in the world, customers started to panic buy, fueled by media pictures of what was happening perhaps in Australia or India. And so we were already beginning to experience shortages. And so the month before we went into lockdown was our most challenging, I would say, in terms of food supply. As soon as lockdown was in place, we started to have what I could really only describe as a tsunami of food donated, which was all short life surplus from the food service industry. But just as that happened, the communities and the charities that we support going into lockdown, they stopped cooking, they were closing down. So they wanted ambient essential store cupboard items that they could use for food box deliveries. And those were the very items that were in short supply. So a bit like yourself, Brianna, we spoke to the food retailers. We actually launched through a trade association called the Institute of Grocery Distributors, the IGD. We launched an appeal to industry, including the retailers, to give us donations. And some of the retailers responded really quickly with some very generous donations of food. Tesco's immediately turned around with a £15 million donation of food, all ambient for us. Even though it meant that their board were having difficult conversations with their supply chain teams, saying, we've got to do the right thing here. And they actually went to great lengths and put a team on it with a board level sponsor to help us, which was fantastic. At the same time, the Scottish government, so the devolved nations and the Welsh government and Northern, well, not so much Northern Ireland, were very generous and stepped up immediately with funds. The UK government, the Westminster government, were much slower, and it was only after we'd really pushed industry to meet demand for us, and we were also acting as an umbrella organisation for other food redistributors, that government were really embarrassed into giving us a grant. So our purchased volume went from 2% to 25% of our total volume. Our total volumes at sometimes quadrupled, but overall tripled across the year. So we had to take up additional warehousing space. We were very fortunate in that whilst a lot of our volunteers stood down or were shielding themselves, a lot of other people who were laid off work. So we had more volunteers approach us in 1 week in March than we'd had in the whole of the previous year. So there was a lot of change in our network, dealing with the volumes, the new volunteers, the new space, and we actually set up a parallel distribution network. So interesting to hear yourself, Vandana, with a centralized warehouse supplied by corporates with some pro bono support from a number of sources to help us supply the independent, where there was a crisis food bank, really crisis relief called Trussell Trust organisation, who we decided to supply them separately rather than through our own network, which was chaotic. So in summary, we all learned that we had to work in partnership. We had to communicate more quickly and work more closely, but we've learned a lot of what we could achieve as a result.
Thanks. That was also a really good sort of lay of the landscape, so that the rest of the conversation we can talk specifics. I'm just amazed by what all three of you were facing within your networks, because it wasn't one simple challenge that you were needing to respond to. It was complicated by so many other factors, right? And that's what food bankers are good at. You're good at responding and being flexible. I think one of the themes that I heard from all of you is that you really relied on your existing relationships, right? You had very strong relationships across the industry. For some of the newer food banks on the phone, and I'm kind of taking a left turn off of the script right now. From some of the newer food banks, can you, and I'm sorry, can you talk a little bit around how you first briefly how you built that relationship, but then how you have those hard conversations? I mean, you both said, or I think all of you said, do the right thing to your partners when they're under pressure to meet their customer needs and to drive revenue and profitability. Can you talk a little bit about what someone who doesn't quite have that strong relationship, how you can start to plant the seeds, and sort of how you have those conversations? Vandana, maybe you can take that one first. We'll switch up the order each time.
I'm sorry, Vandana, you're muted at the moment.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So while we have been operating for the last few years, I've been meeting a lot of people from the industry at different forums. It could be from the food industry, from the other non-food companies at various, conferences and events, etc. And, you've been having these conversations. Not all of them, turn into relationships, where you are actually, they are contributing food or funds, but then you are, always in touch with them. And then one thing which I found very useful during the pandemic was that while we were, we could easily reach out to our existing partners, I did a lot of posts on my LinkedIn. That is my personal LinkedIn, where I had, developed so many contacts over the entire career, you can say, the last decades. And when I did these posts on LinkedIn, I found so many people reach out to me, from different organizations, that how they could help, how they could partner in different ways. So it was food, it was funds, it was, whether helping us just connect, because in the initial stages of the pandemic, when there was a lockdown, it was very difficult to even, send out your trucks to pick up the food or for the distribution, and we needed special police permissions, etc. So there were people who contacted me on LinkedIn. These were actually personal contacts built over the years, but just those posts, I hadn't realized that would be able to get so much support from people who were working in different organizations. So that was one very useful connect that I could build.
That's a great idea. That's not something that you would just, again, it's using every resource at your disposal, right? Just a reminder to those on the call, please either If you have a question, raise your hand. David and Tony are both watching, and then we're watching the chat. So help us take this conversation in the way that's most beneficial to you. Brianna, just to build on that question in terms of how you were able to have those conversations, how did you have the second piece of the conversation was, we don't want to pay the same as your retail customers? Because I mean, it's a balance, right? You're willing to pay, but how do you have that conversation?
I think it was, for us in Australia, a conversation about transparency and the way we communicate the message, because the retailers were under so much pressure through panic buying, and we saw some really terrible behaviour from customers and consumers in Australia, where they were quite abusive towards the staff working in the retailers. So for us, we really offered an olive branch to the retailers and said, we want to back you in, we want to support you, and we know that we can be a trusted voice to the community. And again, the timing was helpful in that we were coming off the bushfires, so community sentiment and trust in food bank was extremely high. But every time panic buying has started in Australia, the first voice that people hear calling out that behaviour is Food Bank Australia's. I do personal videos, we put messages out asking people to be responsible in their purchasing and to be respectful of retailers and manufacturers, that they are there to help us, and that by being irresponsible with purchasing patterns, it actually hurts Australia's most vulnerable first. That message has been so powerful that the Prime Minister and our Social Services Minister quote Food Bank Australia in their media releases on this issue now, because we are a trusted voice. And I think through those relationships that you're all building, and I know across the Asia Pacific network, this is about building those relationships. For us, when we first had conversations with manufacturers and retailers, we assumed they would always be driven by money, by profitability, that by reducing their food waste costs and their landfill costs or their dumping costs, it would save them money, therefore they would donate. That is no longer what drives manufacturers, certainly in Australia, and I would argue globally. This is about social return on investment. This is about engaging and motivating their staff and knowing that their staff deeply believe in something and that the company is actually delivering on outcomes. This is about delivering on sustainability outcomes. This is about humanizing the story and telling the stories of vulnerable people who they are assisting. We're finding here it is that storytelling and the heroing and championing of the companies that are going above and beyond. That is what is leading to greater donations and greater outcomes. So when we went to the retailers and the manufacturers and said we've been very fortunate to secure funding from government, in our case it's about $15 million, which is about 15 times what we would normally get in Australia. When we went to the retailers and manufacturers, we said, we finally have money to offer. We want to give back to you, but we need to be responsible to taxpayers, and we need to make sure we have longevity, because we think this virus is going to be around for a long time. And they were good enough to say to us, we get it. We know that at the moment, with these in such short supply, you should be paying absolute top dollar, but they were very, very good to us, and we were very good to them. And I come back to Vandana's point about LinkedIn. When you work in the food and grocery industry, you want to be recognized by your peers. Sure, shareholders are great, boards are wonderful, but your peers calling you out for excellence, that drives a lot of ego and a lot of motive, and that worked brilliantly for us.
Excellent, thank you. That's another view that's really important in terms of how to have these conversations. Joe, why don't you share from, I see some questions coming in, but I want to hear from the UK and Fair Share perspective. How did you have these conversations around best value for your fundraising dollar, right? To be able to build relationships and access the food you needed to be the best steward of the funding that the public and the government is trusting you with.
Yes, and it was certainly something we were very mindful of, that it was known that the supermarkets were doing very well. They'd got very high levels of trade, and so that they would at some point be called out for making profits potentially out of a catastrophe, a pandemic. And so we were to some extent pushing against an open door when it came to value, because they themselves were aware of that potential criticism. But as well as that, we had discussions with government that said, you need to be, you would not want it to be in the media. Government money is being spent with corporate food retail corporations who are making huge profits on the back of taxpayer funding. So we actually, at our suggestion, got them to write into our contract that we would have to buy at cost plus a minimal handling fee. So we were able to say with complete integrity to the retailers and to any manufacturers that it's a contractual requirement that we buy at cost. Now, of course, we didn't go in and audit or anything like that, but just saying that just meant that they could easily share amongst their colleagues in the organization or whatever, that there's no issue here, it's just a cost plus. Secondly, as Brianna said, the CSR, the retailers and the manufacturers were, might not be the best phrase, but they were almost falling over themselves to outdo each other, to demonstrate to their consumers just how much they were helping. And in particular, we were backed by a quite high profile sports personality of a football team, a chap called Marcus Rashford, who plays for Manchester United. He started tweeting things about us. And so then, of course, brands want to be associated with social media influencers. So again, we had 160 new food partners from a normal base of 550, 600 who approached us during the pandemic, just wanting to be associated with us. So we had to be careful as well that we weren't allowing sort of greenwash, as we would call it, people just trying to tick a box. But generally the retailers, where they couldn't give us product, a couple of them actually said, we really don't feel we can spare any product, but we'll give you money. And they opened doors with manufacturers. So it was a combination of retailers, manufacturers, funding and product that got us through it. And then just storytelling, making sure that we were quick with social media endorsement, exposing, not people don't want to just say it's X tons of food or X dollars or pounds. They actually want stories of how is it helping people? What's the personal story here? You know, and whilst you don't want sort of poverty porn, you actually do need to get that message across in a sensitive, dignified way. So excuse the expression.
I've never heard that before, so I've learned something tonight. Thank you for that, poverty porn. There's some questions coming in the chat that I wanted to stop and let them ask from Taiwan. David, can you unmute them, or maybe you guys can unmute yourselves? You were asking about the discount amount. Can you unmute yourself and then ask? There you are, I see. I think you're still muted though.
I think Nancy isn't on mute, but we're struggling to hear. So Karen, maybe if you can get that question.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Nancy. Yeah, the question is, and I think Joe, you sort of answered this when you were talking about cost plus, but I think the question came in during Brianna when you were speaking in terms of what kind of discount were you trying to get? You know, 50%, 70% more? How were you negotiating?
It varied markedly on the product, on the quantities, on the timing. Traditionally, through our collaborative supply program, we like to deliver gearing of somewhere between 1 to 5 and 1 to 8, which means for every $1 invested, we get $5 or even $8 worth of food delivered. That was our end game and that was our goal. We knew it wasn't necessarily going to be achievable, but at least getting that product at cost was really desirable. But I have to be honest, when it came to products like toilet paper, rice, pasta, we would have been very satisfied with cost price or anywhere near it because it was just so hard to get.
Okay, but you were starting from cost plus,
correct,
as opposed to retail discount.
Oh yeah, retail was never an option.
Okay, or even
we
wholesale.
Knew that would correct, and not even wholesale, because we knew that would actually, coming back to the point that Joe made, that would have actually been quite embarrassing. And we were very fortunate, not that government would ever interfere in supermarket pricing debate because it's illegal, but the government made very clear that they had a responsibility to taxpayers. And when it came to government funding, we needed to be responsible. So we used that card when we need to.
Okay. Vandana, did you have a perspective on that too? Because I know you didn't touch on that.
So we had been, pre-COVID, we had been purchasing at a few locations for our school nutrition program. However, during the COVID, when our purchasing increased substantially, we had to now develop vendors at a number of new locations, but any traveling was out of question. We had to establish relationship, negotiate prices, agree on payment terms, quality control, everything had to be done remotely. This seemed to be a very daunting task given the vast geography and diversity also. So one of our donors is in the hospitality sector, and they have vendors across the country, and they connected us to their vendors. These vendors were very dependable. They gave us great prices, foregoing their profits entirely. Not only that, they also bagged the products for us. So when we ordered a combination of 7 products, they would bag it for us and also deliver it to us at our locations. This was really an invaluable service, especially when the supply chains had been disrupted and there was shortages around and there were price variations, price depending upon demand supply situation. Prices were also varying, especially for the grains, etc., in the wholesale market. So these vendors, which are hospitality partner connected with us, was really an invaluable support.
That's interesting, because you used your partner to get to their vendors, and then
Yes.
being able to get that added value of packing is worth paying, right? Because all of you were also, you were talking about volunteers coming in the beginning, but everybody had shut down that affected volunteers at some point, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharing that. Astrid, you had a question about managing relationships. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry for the background noise. The kids just decided to scream.
Hey, we're
Hope
all
you don't
in
hear
life.
them.
It's okay. No,
Yeah.
you're fine.
Yeah, so this is probably, I don't know if it's irrelevant to you guys because you're more established food bank. So it's all based on relationships with the donors, right? So my question will be how to build them up. So we don't want to come across as someone that only come to them when we're in need, right? So we need to have, continuously build that relationship. So do you have anyone that are recruited or purposely in that role to do that? Or is it mainly you guys, building it with the donors? Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll say, Brianna, you're muted. Do you want to answer first? And then
Yes,
maybe Joe.
and from one mum to another, Astrid, well done you. I know what it's like. I have my door closed, the dog and the kids are out there. It's great times. We're all in the same boat. From our perspective, yes, account management is critically important. We have a dedicated supply chain team, and their purpose in life is account management. And those of you who've had the fortune to meet Michael Davidson from our team, he would be the first to say to you, his #1 mission in life is to keep it simple for the donor. One point of contact, one message, one rule, respond in 24 hours, set your expectations up front. That is a culture that he's built within the team, so that whether it be a manufacturer, a retailer, a farm group, they know who to call at Food Bank. There is no such thing as a silly question when they call us. One of the challenges we had a number of years ago was that because of our name being Food Bank, a lot of people didn't realize that we could take non-food items. So things like shampoo, conditioner, sanitary items, etc., they didn't know they could donate to us. And we've worked really hard, one, to educate everyone on what we can take and what we can't take, but 2, to make it a safe place to ask silly questions, because we love silly questions and we ask them ourselves. So we're very clear to donors in saying, you can ring us and ask us anything. Is it about transport, logistics, the type of product, the best before date, the use by date? Ask us what you like. We do, and I saw Nicholas's question earlier in the chat, not that I was looking, but yes, we have Good Samaritan legislation in Australia. It's never been legally tested, and I'm touching wood because I don't want it to be. But certainly from our perspective, we work very hard to explain that legislation to the donor. We work very hard to make sure the donor understands what happens to their donation. And we work really hard to make sure we have touch points right across the business. It's not enough to just meet with the CEO or meet with the head of supply chain or the head of logistics. We want to know what their government relations staff are interested in. We want to know what their research teams are interested in, the product development teams. We want to meet with everyone to know what makes them tick and why they are passionate about giving to food bank, so that we can better tailor our programs to meet their needs. So that's my long-winded way of saying yes, have an account manager, make them dedicated, meet with them regularly, find out what motivates and drives them. If it's sustainability and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, great, gear your messaging that way. If it is about social impact, give them some great case studies, and we use poverty porn as the label here as well. So you've got to be really sensitive in the way that you communicate the message, but if you don't tell your donors what you're doing with their valuable product, why would they give it to you?
Right. Joe, same question to you in terms of, and I think that Astrid, respect that these are larger food banks and networks, but they've grown, right? They've come from smaller. So, and I think everybody has grown exponentially this past year. So I think all of these questions are relevant in terms of how you start, how you continue, and how you grow. Joe, can you answer that as well? And then can you also just answer Nicholas's question about whether you have Good Sam? Any sort of
we don't have any legislation in the UK.
Okay, but you're working on it. But you're
working on it. Yeah, we're working on it.
Okay.
So yes, as Karen says, you know, we're very fortunate that we've been running for 25 years at Fair Share in the UK, and we've got some established, well-resourced teams. So I've got 15 people in the food team whose sole role is to manage accounts, those sort of 600 or so accounts. And we've also got a separate supply chain team who deal with the flow of food through the network. And then we've also got a separate fundraising team. So we do have multiple touch points with many of our food partners, which, as Brianna says, means that you really understand them, you're well embedded, and what you're doing is understood. But not everybody's in that situation. And there's many companies who we deal with who we don't have that level of engagement with. So I think you've got to be strategic about who you prioritize your resource, who you put your resource into working with, making sure it's the right food, the right volumes, the right positioning. And also find, as you say, just being somebody that pops up when there's a problem isn't really the right way. It's how can you meet their needs? What are their CSR objectives? If it's volunteering experiences, fundraising for staff, impacting the community, meeting the SDGs or whatever. One of the things that has really been helpful to us, although that's not why we have it, is that we have run a back of store food waste collection where we link charities to supermarket outlets. So a third of our volume goes directly from a back of a supermarket at the end of the day to a local charity. And we connect 3 major retailers across the UK with thousands of charities for that service. So that meant that every part of those organisations regularly had contact with us or charities that we support. So there was a very good, so they were aware of the problem as well. And I think that some of the retailers who responded the quickest were those where we had those relationships in place, but by no means all. I think though you just definitely need to think about where you spread your resource, both in crisis and out of it, so that you can cope with things like this.
Vandana, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, but I'm going to interject one statement here that I think you're hearing consistently, that having a team or a person that works on relationships from a food sourcing and relationship building is really important. And for some of the newer, smaller food banks on here, I know a lot of you CEOs and EDs are carrying this burden, and that's really hard to do when you're trying to prioritize, to your point. So I think that I saw Chris and Craig on, I think they would nod their heads that thinking about investing in a relationship manager support team is important. Vandana, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I can understand that, investing in a relationship manager is very critical. And we are planning to invest more in that area going forward. However, in the past, our entire focus, in our growth strategy of building alliances and partnerships has been very helpful, because I feel that what one person can do, one relationship manager can do, or what one organization can do, what actually these partnership and alliances can together bring to the table is much, much more than that. And therefore, we find our partners, our supporters, our friends of food banks, they have been very critical in helping us reach out to food donors, other donors, and they've played a very important role. And there we have not just two hands, we've got hundreds of people who are speaking for us.
That's a really good point. So talk about what is your structure in terms of your does your team work in terms of food sourcing, and how was staff impacted during COVID?
The work increased exponentially during the pandemic. Yeah. So initially we were just putting in innumerable extra hours and weekends. Our food banking partners all over the different locations, they also stepped up and took in more volunteers. But what was very fascinating was that we got a lot of support from the police and the administration also. Initially, in places where permissions could not be obtained, there was because India went in for a full nationwide lockdown, everything was shut, and that helped us to avert really the health crisis. So we also had police offering their vehicles, their trucks, to transport food for us, both the purchases and also for distribution. Then the entire administration, which was working throughout the lockdown, they really supported us in, the distribution, in identifying the need, the clusters of people, where the need was the most, and in distribution, really everybody offered their support. And then, of course, we also had to add extra staff. I feel this food crisis will take time to be, fully resolved. The need for food assistance is still very strong and will continue for a couple of months. The course of the pandemic is still uncertain. We don't know how it's going to pan out still in the coming months, and therefore we have plans to add some extra staff also.
I know, and you guys are doing a great job of scaling up as appropriate, right? Just for Nicholas's question, do you have any sort of Good Sam liability protection in India?
No, we do not have the liability protection agreement as yet. So we sign off agreements with our donors where we kind of offer them a release from liability, and we take that liability onto ourselves.
Okay, so you do have a contract of some sort that you agree to. Brianna, do you guys have a contract that you sign with donors?
Yeah, we have very strong partnership agreements, and we have food acceptance guidelines that we make available to all of our state and territory food banks and to the donor to explain what we will take and what we won't take. And we work with food scientists where we can extend beyond the best before date. So the use by date is a fixed date that is set for health reasons in Australia. The best before date generally is around aesthetics, how it looks. It's still fine and safe to eat, but it may not have the greatest eatability at that point in time. So we work with food scientists and the manufacturer to say, can we extend that best before date by several weeks or several months, depending on the product, to make sure that it is still a good eating experience, because at the end of the day, this is about their brand integrity. And I'm glad that you've raised the issue of resourcing, because we purchased more food in a 3-month block last year than we did in the last 3 years. And the practical reality of that was the number of purchase orders we had to generate, the number of agreements we had to sign, the number of reports we had to churn out each month, the reporting back to government, back to the donor. The administrative burden of that was huge. We were asking our teams to operate at least 120% of capacity. We were fortunate to secure funding to put on an extra headcount to support that team. But I'll be really honest that most of our projects for last year were put on hold and business development flew out the window so that we could focus on the task at hand. So we are behind as far as business development is concerned. We are behind with many of the wonderful and innovative programs we would have loved to have implemented in the last 12 months because we simply needed to make sure that we were resourcing that team effectively. And one of the big challenges, and I know this is going to sound like a first world problem, and I apologize, but it would be dishonest not to say it. When you have success in securing funds and you have success in fundraising, there is a huge expectation that you spend those funds, that you spend them quickly, and you report back really clearly on what you are doing with those funds. And when your supply chains are so dramatically disrupted, the practical reality of being able to achieve that is really hard. And I do think for some of the bigger food banks and for those food banks who've been really successful in fundraising, corporate partnerships and government in the last 12 months, that's a big area of risk for us all right now, is making sure we meet the obligations and responsibilities that come with good fortune.
Exactly. I want to build on that in a minute, but for there's a couple of good questions, Astrid. You're really doing a great job of keeping us honest here. Stepping back just a second, and Joe, maybe you can take this first around how did you first get the dollars to purchase the food, and if you can separate out. Talk about the process for government and then the process for other funding for the food banks that are still trying to, thinking about how to better resource their needs.
Right, thank you. Yes, so prior to COVID, we had, if you've had a chance to see the presentation, we had a scheme which we still have, which we call Surplus with Purpose, where we had raised funds from a private donor and from government to access surplus food that would otherwise go to waste, whether it's harvesting product that was going to lie in the fields or packaging up product that would otherwise have gone to anaerobic digestion. And we had raised those funds through lobbying of government, to be honest, and through direct approaches to high net worth individuals. Then when we started to purchase product, as in non-surplus product, I'll call it, for Brexit, it was actually not our own initiation. It was the Scottish government. It was a political gesture. They had a meeting with the UK Prime Minister, and the First Minister of Scotland wanted to make a political gesture and say, things are going to be really bad if you don't get a deal with Europe. And look, it's so bad, we're having to give money to food banks. So we were sort of given some money at short notice, unexpectedly. As I say, it was really just a political thing. However, they were very serious about how that money should be spent and in terms of the types of food and the communities that it supported. So that gave us a precedent to use with the Westminster government. But we actually started out, our first thought was to ask for donations from industry. And we didn't use public or corporate donations of money to buy food. We did use it for transport and running costs, but we only used government funds for buying food. So once we'd got to the stage where we knew we couldn't meet all of the demand with the industry helping us, we were in parallel discussions with government saying this is what's going on. And we put together an ask. We've got a rather ambitious, our CEO, Lindsay Bloss, was quite ambitious. So he originally said, we want 25 million sterling. We only got 10 million. But then later in the year, in the autumn, they gave us a further 16, which we're still spending at the moment. And in order to justify your question of how do you get it, we did put together quite detailed plans of the types of food, the expected costs, how long that would last, how many people it would support. There's quite a strong KPI suite associated with that grant, actually. The rest of what we also did in terms of general funds to help our running costs was we were fortunate that there was a media event called The Big Give. There's an organisation called Comic Relief. I'm not sure if they're known outside the UK, and they ran a very short notice terrestrial TV campaign called The Big Give to get people to donate to help, and we were the major feature on that TV show. And that then started individual giving. So individual giving was a very small part of our fundraising prior to COVID, and it became a significant proportion in the last year. So all different routes, I guess, to raise it's about raising our profile, influencing the right people, and being very clear what you want the money for, what you're going to do with it, and what impact it will have.
Right.
And then just really quickly, I think you described very well, Brianna, the sort of really chaotic time that we've all been through. We had never bought, apart from this small amount in Scotland, we didn't have a purchase order process, believe it or not. We had to invent one. We had to get extra resource into our finance team. Our board of trustees were a bit concerned about very large checks being written. So we had to have a governance around that. All at a time when people aren't exactly twiddling their thumbs and sitting back with time to think. It's people are working very long hours in their homes, dealing with the isolation and all of those things. As you said, Vandana, nobody could meet, and we previously met all the time. Right. So it's just, and that's where your team working, being really clear on your priorities and focusing and saying all those other programs we had in place, as you said, Brianna, that they're out the door.
Right.
They're on hold because it's all about delivering our priorities.
Right. I want to come back to the questions, but Vandana, I'd like to give you a chance to talk about how did you approach for funding? Because I don't believe you had the same sort of influx of government funding. Did you?
No.
Yes.
No. So the government of India has its own very, very large program called the public distribution system, under which it distributes rations to people in, the underprivileged people. So we did not receive any funding from the government at all. So we were basically raising resources from the corporate sector, and that's where we came up with this program of providing these emergency ration kits, which comprised of rice, wheat flour, pulses, oil, cooking oil, spices, etc. So we launched a program regarding that for providing emergency food assistance, and we reached out to corporates who were then willing, if they were willing to support this distribution. So then we could tell them exactly whom are we going to support, for how long, with what products. So these ration kits were for to provide rations for 1 week for a family of 4 to 5 people. So the corporates knew exactly how many people they are helping for how long, and accordingly they supported us with the funds to distribute those, to purchase and distribute those ration kits.
So you had a very clear selling story, right? So being able to tell them about their impact, that's great.
And we came back and gave them the reports of where they were distributed, sent them a lot of pictures, which they found, it really motivated them to, to even direct more funds for the project.
Right. In fact, why don't you answer the question from Astrid that was asking, I'm sorry, Astrid, I'm going to paraphrase it for you so I can keep these all sort of going on in order here. What type of reporting do you do, Vandana, for your corporate donors? And then how specific, how frequent? You're saying photos and things. Can you be specific about what kind of reporting you're providing?
Okay, in the pre-COVID times, when there were projects running, then we had very clear-cut directions in the project report itself, that there would be quarterly reports or end of project report, annual report, or end of project reports. However, for these short-term support which was coming in, that, okay, we want to distribute 4,000 ration kits for 4,000 families, or around 20,000 people. So this would get executed within 15 days, within 2 to 4 weeks maximum. So we generally provide an end of project report about where we had reached out to how many people, how many families. Some of the corporates also wanted to have the contact details of the beneficiary organizations. So we have even provided the, contact details of the exact families to whom the ration kits were distributed to. And otherwise, we send them a lot of pictures of the distribution. And the corporates were really surprised that at a time when there was complete lockdown, everybody was at home, how our volunteers were out there, from day one, going from house to house distributing, because it was not, so even if our school meals program, earlier the children came to the school and all the 1,000 children in a school were, provided meals in the school. But now we were providing the, take home rations to the children at their homes. So this was a logistics miracle, so as to say, what we were trying to accomplish, at the time when everything was shut down. So that's how,
But that's a powerful story. I mean, you're right. You were serving children in a school, and now you're serving families in their homes. That's a powerful story from a funding perspective as well as impact. I recognize we're getting close on time, but I want to finish these couple more questions. If you guys can all stay on for a few more minutes, you're fine? Okay. No one else needs to go to bed like the rest of us. So there was a specific question from Brianna's very amazing Kate on her team to Joanna. Do you ever have reactive purchasing opportunities where they come to you as opposed to you soliciting? And coming from Feeding America, I know we dealt with this all the time. Can you talk about how you manage sort of those unsolicited opportunities? Did I get that right, Kate, or do you want to jump in and unmute and clarify that question?
Oh no, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay.
But just in terms of like unsolicited, but also you've set up the relationship where they know they can bring that to you, I guess.
Got it. So it's not totally cold calling, it's a relationship, right?
So if I've understood that correctly, so prior to COVID, purchasing wasn't really part of our model. We are very much an organisation who focuses on surplus food. So although we would fairly regularly have people approach us trying to sell us food, which was non-surplus, we would just always say, well, that's not what we do. Thank you very much. But if you've got some surplus, we'd like to talk to you. So then when we got to the situation in the pandemic that we needed to buy food, we went to existing companies we had existing relationships with. We call them food partners, for the foods that we wanted. Of course, it did get out because it was covered in the trade media about the government grant. So you do then get organisations, particularly some rather fly ones, trying to make a buck out of a shortage. But we didn't deal with any of those. So we're probably a bit narrow in that respect because we don't use fundraised monies for purchasing food, even though that does present us with some dilemmas because there's always need, particularly during the school holidays and things like that. And we often have, I call it a healthy tension of, should we go out and buy? And it may be that our model will evolve, but we will always predominantly be surplus outside. So we were 98% surplus food prior to COVID. This year, we're probably going to end up about 65% surplus, sorry, in the 12 months to this financial year. And in the year going forward, I'm sure purchasing might be a small element of what we do. But the decision of whether we want to, if we're not getting government funds for it, I'm not sure that we would at the moment want to use fundraised funds for buying food when we can use them for, buying surplus food, as I mentioned, our sort of intervention to pack off. That's the closest we come to it. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but that's our situation.
Cool, thanks.
That's great, thank you.
Good. Kate, I'll just interject from Feeding America's perspective. We would not buy anything that wasn't full shelf life product, and we would not buy from distributors, if that helps. I did so. Okay. Oh, Astrid, to Brianna, now that COVID's under, in fact, this was going to be kind of one of my closing questions. COVID will end at some point in our lives, hopefully. What does it look like for going forward? How do you think purchasing will be part of your future total sourcing plan? I'm going to end with you, Brianna, because I think yours is going to be the most. This is great that we've got different representation of where purchasing fits into your purchasing strategies pre-COVID, and thinking about how we come out. This is a great question to build on, Astrid. So thank you. So let's let Vandana answer first. Where do you think purchasing will fit into your overall your food sourcing strategy going forward?
Okay. Pre-COVID, about 75% of the food that came to us was the surplus food from the food industry, but about 25% was still purchasing. And that was because we had added school nutrition program to our programs. Now, why we added this program was that we found that the surplus food which came to us, we had no control over what comes to us, right? And when we started thinking in terms of nutrition, because that's also a very big challenge in India, undernourishment, that we realized that to have some control over what nutrition you are able to provide your target beneficiaries can only be done when you decide what you want to give. And that's where when we started the school nutrition program and started delivering nutritious meals to children in schools. So going further, we will be continuing with the school nutrition program. But more than that, the pandemic has highlighted that healthy diets are important to supporting the immune system, which is actually the first defense against any disease or pandemic. Therefore, going forward, we want to develop a strategy to acquire food that supports healthy diets, providing nutrition to the undernourished and preventing overnutrition. Some of, especially with the surplus food which comes to us, which we have no, control over, they could also, be providing overnutrition also in terms of fats or sugars, etc. So therefore, we want to continue with our purchasing program to acquire food that support healthy diets. And, I think that supporting our beneficiaries with the essential staples, which is the rice and wheat flour or pulses, which are generally not donated as surplus by any food company, that purchasing we will have to continue, and we will continue in the future. And so we plan to develop purchasing partners with wholesalers, with fresh produce markets. And one more thing was that we also realized during the pandemic the fragility of the supply chains. Like the others also mentioned, that they are highly fragile, and anytime there can be a breakdown. So we are planning to also work on a program where we are able to connect the farmers with the beneficiaries, so that there could be a flow of nutrition, a continuous flow of nutritious produce from the farms to the beneficiaries, who are in need. And we could thereby also be helping these small farmers, by giving them, a market for their produce locally.
So being very strategic in your purchasing, that's great in terms of filling the gaps for your beneficiaries. That's great. Joanna, do you think purchasing will continue to go back to being 2%, or do you think we're looking at a different factor going forward?
Well, we are certainly mindful of the points that Vandana made about nutrition, and that if you rely solely on surplus, you inevitably don't get the ideal mix of food types. That there might be certain times of the year when you haven't got a particular product that you'd like, and it particularly comes up for us during the school holidays, when you've got a lot of school programs, holiday programs addressing what's sometimes referred to as holiday hunger. But as I say, we haven't previously almost been in a situation that we've had the funds to go and buy full life manufactured product. So I think that would be a last resort for us, as we prefer, but we will certainly continue to use our funds to to buy surplus by not buying the material, but by paying for the processes to make it available to us. And I think we'll probably, we do sometimes get commissioned on a local basis, some of the food banks by local councils and authorities to provide food during the school holidays when we do buy on a very small scale. So, but I think we're a long way away from the sorts of programs that I think you've got in Brianna in Australia, where you're really integrated. I'm very quite jealous, actually. I think it's something that we need to consider longer term, but we just need to look at how we can prioritize our funds to be able to do that.
Recognizing this is a growth process, and it has to mirror the needs of your community and the resources in your community. Brianna, going forward, I mean, we know purchasing is a big piece of yours, but what do you think it's going to look like post-COVID?
I think we'll actually increase the percentage, the overall percentage. I think we'll move away from it only being 15% to being higher. We have seen a dramatic shift in our model at Food Bank Australia. Our traditional model is to distribute food through beneficiary organisations or charities or agencies, depending on your language that you speak. We have done so much direct to client work in the last 12 months that I think there will be an expectation that that continues, and that is predominantly in the form of hampers or bundles or boxes, in order to make them uniform, easy to transport, safe to transport, predictable, positive gearing, easy to report on. Purchase food gives us that reliability and that dependability. So I think we'll see a lot more of it. We've already seen this year, for those of you familiar with our collaborative supply program, we've got more and more, in fact, 5 new product lines this year for our collaborative supply program. I think it will only grow. And my last 2 messages, in case we are wrapping up. 1, thank you, GFN, for holding this in our time zone. Nicholas reminded us all beautifully. I don't look like you do at 2:30 in the morning. We'll see that next week when I'm doing next week's one. But equally, please don't hesitate to contact us. We have provided our contact details on the bottom of the briefing note. If we can help in any way, we would be delighted to. We make mistakes all the time. We are still learning as well, but we've got 25 years of history that we're very happy to share. And equally, please, don't be offended if we ask you silly questions when we want to borrow your great ideas as well. And that includes you, Jo, because I think your Surplus with Purpose program is just terrific. So thank you all.
I want to thank you all as well. I really was grateful for this opportunity to host this and to be able to learn from you all. I think that we appreciate your time of your day or your night. We don't mind working 24/7. We know you all do too. So we're happy to host so that this time our Asia Pacific friends didn't have to either stay up all night or get up early in the morning. So thank you, Brianna, for your time. Thank you, Joanna, for your time, and Vandana for your time, your expertise, and for your teams, because we know that this is not something that is an individual that accomplishes all of this work. So we appreciate all the work that's been behind. And Kate, thanks for doing the document for Brianna when she was on holiday. I do have to also thank the sponsors for our virtual as well as our ongoing FBLI sessions. So thank you to General Mills, HEB, Brambles, Cargill, the DLA Piper Foundation, Fundación Lala, and Ingredion. We will have the session recorded and up sometime tomorrow. I don't know if that's our tomorrow or your tomorrow, but in the next 24 to 48 hours. So you should see an email coming from the FBLI team. Thank you to January for getting up, staying up in the middle of the night, to Tony and to David for the same as well, for making all of this go so smoothly. Thank you for your questions. I don't think I missed anything else. The links are in terms of the case studies. If you hadn't had a chance to read them ahead of time, do. There's a lot of great information in there. Hopefully this has been helpful to just highlight some of the things to think about as we all are growing our food sourcing programs and being able to utilize funding to access more food to feed the communities that we serve is just something that we're all going to continue to have to figure out as appropriate in our community. So thank you. With that, I'm going back to bed. The rest of you have a great day, a great night. And we will be I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. The 3 of you will see you again next week. Jo, good luck with your move.
Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, nice to meet you all. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.